Okay, the press conference on the joint World Bank OECD report on managing natural disasters is about to start. So if some of you want to be in the press briefing area, please come here. Otherwise, you can listen from your seats. Thank you. I'll hand the floor over to Marcos.
Thank you so much. We're launching this publication on fiscal resilience to natural disasters. And I'm here with my colleague Olivier Mahul from the World Bank, because this is a joint product. It's a very fruitful cooperation with the World Bank, and I'd like to thank our colleagues from the bank, and Olivier specifically, who has been very much involved in producing this report. I want to say a few words about the context of this report and where it comes from in our work program here at the OECD. We have a high-level risk forum at the OECD, which of course participation of our member countries, but a number of partner countries as well. And this high-level risk forum has a very ambitious work program looking at resilience and all type of risks, natural disasters, but also man-made risks, and how can governments build resilience, and how can governments learn from each other to build resilience. Just a few years back, the forum prepared a recommendation which was adopted by the OECD Council as a recommendation on the governance of critical risks. And this work is again part of that discussion on the governance of critical risks. Now, about the report itself, we have seen in the last decade a major increase in impact of natural disasters, perhaps not so much in terms of lives. I think we have perhaps learned a little bit to mitigate the loss of life for some of those major natural disasters. But in terms of economic losses, that's been a major increase in the impact of natural disasters. Just the last couple of years, 2017 for instance, saw the most devastating hurricane season in the US, and then of course the wildfires in California in 2018, the Japan earthquake. So if you measure by 10-year intervals, the last 10 years were perhaps the worst we've ever had in history. And then you question, okay, well, you may or not believe in climate change, and here at the OECD we see very clear evidence of climate change. But even putting that aside, what we have observed is that the increase in the losses, in the financial losses from natural disasters, has a lot to do with the fact that there are more economic assets built around the world in areas of risk. And with economic growth, of course, with increased population growth, so it's just natural that the losses increase, because there are more and more assets that are vulnerable to natural disasters. What we have seen, and that's perhaps a positive note that we have in this report, is that most OECD countries have developed, have increased their capacity to respond to emergencies. Okay, that's very good news, and that's linked to what I had said before. There's been a drastically reduction in the number of victims of those natural disasters in OECD countries. So countries are learning how to build resilience, and this is really the heart of the work we're doing here at the OECD, is providing peer learning opportunities so countries can improve resilience. Again, disasters can continue to cause tremendous economic disruption, even in the more advanced countries. Now, the report is about who is shouldering the share, or the main share of the cost of dealing with those economic losses. And what we have observed is central governments mostly are responsible for paying the damages to infrastructure assets. And this is the case even when those assets are not owned by the central governments. Very often in most countries, those assets are either owned by let's say, subnational governments or the government entities, even private sector governments, so that it presents a major cost for central governments. Also, central governments support the households and businesses to get back on their feet as rapidly as possible. And so that's again a trend that we have observed. And I would say that, especially in cases, and unfortunately most cases, when the private disaster risk insurance markets are not well developed, and there are very few countries where they are developed. In most countries, even in the OECD, they're not sufficiently developed. The governments end up providing even higher levels of support. Again, we're not here suggesting what's right or what's wrong in terms of what governments should provide. There are societal choices that need to be made about the role of governments in this case. What the report is about is how to manage the budgetary risks. And what we are arguing here is that it needs to be, those risks need to be planned for and managed more effectively than they have been in the past. So the questions we asked in the report is whether countries were aware of the type of costs that they may be facing when disasters strike. Do they understand what would happen to their finances if, unfortunately, the worst case scenario materialized? And finally, do they integrate what we have already, existing knowledge of disaster scenarios in their fiscal impact or the fiscal risk assessments, in the budget processes? Are they integrating that effectively? And what the report says, again, is that very often the main damage, the main item which is driving the central government spending on disaster damage assessments is related to damage to public infrastructure assets and related service disruptions. And they represent very, very important liabilities for government. And many countries have been able, to a certain degree, to increase their capacity to monitor their exposure to the assets. But they are, at the same time, and that perhaps the warning here is that it's been very challenging, and most governments don't do a good enough job to set up clear rules, ex ante rules, to define what damages will be paid for and to what extent they will be paid for. So governments understand more and more they're monitoring the risks, but they are not putting in place the right mechanisms to decide before the disaster strike who is going to pay for what and under what conditions. So there are lots of I would say, uncertainty or lack of definition or that in this particular issue. What happens really is that because the rules for financial assistance are broad or vague, the governments end up absorbing more costs than they should, than perhaps necessary. Again, we're not questioning the implicit commitments for the government to step in, but in the absence of formal rules, we see that there's a less efficient allocation of responsibilities between central government and local governments, between central governments and different government agencies, between public sector and private sector. So this is really the effect that you have of not having clear rules ex ante about who's going to pay for what and under what conditions. We feel that if rules had been clear, you can lead to significantly reduced liabilities. And even if you look at the dynamic aspect, over time you will probably also reduce the potential damage. We also find that governments perhaps can do a better job in designing the financial assistance, how they provide financial assistance to households and businesses. the type of conditionality that they should put into those financial assistance, so they can reward good behavior and good investments on the building back phase. So when perhaps the next disaster strikes, there will be perhaps a smarter way to build or a smarter way to conduct business. So this is really, in a nutshell, what I like to say here at the very beginning. I would like to conclude before giving the floor to my friend and colleague Olivier, that we feel that the OECD and the World Bank are just scratching the surface on the type of analysis that we need to do in this particular case. Together with the World Bank, we are planning to continue to work on this in the next few years. There's been huge demand from our member countries, but also from partner countries of the OECD. They are members, of course, of the World Bank. And I think we need to create more peer learning opportunities. One area where we feel there's a great potential for us to move forward is also tapping into different networks at the OECD beyond the high-level risk forum with experts on risk and resilience. I think we need to tap also on the expertise of our senior budget officials network and see how we can link better this work with the work they do on budget processes, so we can give very concrete advice to governments on how to integrate and better plan for those type of liabilities, potential liabilities in the budget cycle. So I'll stop here and give the floor to Olivier, who will complement. Again, Olivier was very much involved in producing this report. He's quite knowledgeable about the conclusions of the report. So Olivier, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Pleasure to be here, and great honor to be able to present this joint report with you today. First and foremost, let me first acknowledge the great work done by our respective teams at the World Bank and OECD under this partnership on fiscal resilience to disasters. And since we first discussed this work back in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, we have come a long way to present this report today. Learning from the experience of both OECD countries and fast-growing middle-income countries, we can develop a more holistic picture of lessons learned and good practices. As Marcus mentioned, this work is very timely. The policy relevance of this report is demonstrated this year by the 2019 G20 finance track under the presidency of Japan, which highlights the need for financial resilience against disasters and extreme events as a key component of sound macro-fiscal policy. And as also mentioned by Marcos, the management of both explicit and implicit contingent liabilities pose a significant challenge to governments due to the ad hoc arrangements regarding the provision of post-disaster financial assistance by central governments, and the absence, in many cases, of cost-sharing mechanisms between central and local governments. The findings of this report highlight the importance of integrating the management of governments' disaster-related contingent liabilities as part of their broader fiscal risk management frameworks. And only proactive management can counterbalance the effects of increased vulnerability to disasters. In that context, let me highlight maybe 4 trends which anchor the work we have done on managing contingent liabilities from disasters in core fiscal and financial planning. Number 1, we can see increasing integration of financial resilience to shocks as a core component of macro-fiscal framework and stability. Number 2, we see increasingly sophisticated financial instruments that directly link financial preparedness to the ultimate assets of people impacted by disasters, and often leveraging the expertise and capital of the private sector. Point number 3, we see an expansion to apply tested tools from climate and disaster risk financing to new sources of risks, including crises, such as pandemics, displacements, and even in the near future, cyber risks, that increasingly look at interconnected and cascading risks. And point number 4, we see a growing push to innovate and unlock the power of new technologies. And for example, the World Bank is investigating to leverage the newest satellite technology to inform financial decisions, working in partnership with the European Space Agency. Of course, every disaster is different, and every country will ultimately face its unique challenges in managing its response. However, we can highlight some key elements to the kind of sustainable future recovery of disasters. Point number one, we need sustainable markets and strong institutions, where risks are shared between public and private stakeholders. And beyond insurance, strong payment systems are needed to ensure funding can efficiently reach the intended beneficiaries on time. Second, investigating in delivery systems for an effective response and recovery. Providing rapid assistance to poor and vulnerable households is a priority in the wake of a disaster. It is one of the areas the World Bank has been working for a long time with their development partners, and we will continue to do so. Third, clear rules for government post-disaster financial assistance. This includes establishing clear cost-sharing mechanisms across different levels of government, making explicit the central role of government to commit to provide financial assistance, but also the role of the local governments to also provide assistance. And last but not least, international collaboration. No country can build financial resilience alone. Disasters have shown us how they can threaten efforts to end poverty and promote shared prosperity. Today we have lessons and experiences we can share among many countries and a progressive momentum to develop technology and innovative financial solutions for prevention, resilience and recovery. We also need to be clear that fiscal and financial planning alone cannot address the risk posed by disasters and climate change. We also need to invest in physical and social resilience. And governments can boost the resilience of businesses and households by making risk reduction part of their framework conditions for co-financing disaster risk management measures. Incentive mechanisms can be provided to sectoral government agencies, subnational governments, and private stakeholders to encourage risk reduction measures and help improve the access to and take-up of risk transfer instruments such as business continuity and household insurance. In the World Bank, this is an important area to support our partner clients and countries. For example, our disaster risk finance and insurance program has grown rapidly, and now we're advising more than 60 countries toward financial resilience as part of the broader climate and disaster risk management agenda. So let me stop here. And again, thanks a lot, and it's been a great pleasure to develop this report and looking forward to further collaboration.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions or comments on the report? We'll be happy to answer them.
We do have time for some questions if anybody has some further questions. If not, I in fact had a question which I think may need some clarification. A lot of the recommendations imply a certain long-term commitment. What can be done in the shorter term, really, to increase resilience, as you were talking about?
So again, let's clarify what we mean by resilience. So we talked usually about physical resilience, financial resilience, and social resilience. And of course, those three components are closely related toward increasing resilience. If I focus particularly on financial resilience, which is also one of the Directorate's reports, having the Minister of Finance being involved early on in the process, trying to better understand and assess the contingent liability or the impact of potential disasters on their fiscal budget as well as on the economy is a major step forward, which then leads them to take more proactive actions. And ultimately what the World Bank is trying to do is to help countries move being a crisis responder, being a crisis responder to a risk manager. And in order to do so, and it was also very well discussed in the previous point, you need to have a kind of right tools in order to assess your risk, to identify your risks, to quantify it, to give some price tag, if you wish, to the risk in order to manage that from a fiscal perspective.
If I may add, I couldn't agree more with what Olivier has just said. Here at the OECD, we have been working on the Paris Collaborative for Green Budgeting, which is something we started at the request of the French government after the Planet Summit in late 2017, and more countries are joining now the Green Collaborative. The idea is that we are using the budget processes to better understand and plan for those risks of those, let's say, natural disasters. But it's very important that in our ideas from the OECD side is that we start making recommendations on how to build this into the budget processes upstream. So the finance ministries and people who make decisions about the budget have the tools that they need to incorporate this in their planning. So we are acting already. We hopefully by the end of this year we'll already have some clear recommendations to governments on how they should incorporate those type of risks into their budget processes. So there's a number of actions that can be taken already in the short term.
Are there any other questions? Yes, front row.
My name is Judy, and I know this report is about OECD countries, but I would like to know, is the World Bank doing a similar thing in developing countries, because we have seen an increase in natural disasters?
Definitely, and this is also one of the reasons we are so happy to partner with OECD on this report, to learn lessons from more advanced countries and try to apply some of these lessons to less advanced countries, middle-income countries or low-income countries. And in both cases, for middle-income and low-income countries, including in African countries, this topic has been taken up by Minister of Finance. They do see, as you said, the impact on their fiscal budget, on their economy of disasters, and the need to plan in advance. Not only in terms of financial, I would say planning, but also making sure that the money, when made available, can quickly reach out to the ultimate beneficiaries. So this kind of continuum of decisions have to be made, and the earlier you can plan, the better then you'll be able to respond, and you'll be more effective to respond in case of disaster. But yes, countries, even more recently with the tropical cyclone Ida hitting Mozambique, this is a topic that has been definitely addressed by those countries.
From our side, if I may, from our side, we're very keen that our collaboration with the World Bank also extends to providing peer learning opportunities to non-OECD countries. We very much have a mandate and to work with countries around the world. We're working, of course, with the G20, but I mentioned the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting. It is open by adherence to developing countries as well. So we're very keen that countries around the world, they don't have to be OECD countries, they join this type of work, and they bring their perspectives. I mean, it's very important that they bring their perspectives. They help us understand better what their needs are, and then we can look at different type of activities where we can learn from each other. So that's from our perspective, the collaboration of the World Bank will not end on this report, and will not end only on providing this analytical underpinning, but also will go further in working with countries around the world to help them implement some of the good practices.
Hello, good morning. My name is Ron Osborne from the French insurance community and the national platform as well. I didn't read the report in details, but I may have two little questions. One is about the fact it seems that the Solidarity Fund for the French case, the European Solidarity Fund, seems not to be included in the scope. Why is that? And is there a more general rule to consider whether supranational fiscal support might be involved to the national one? And my second question, separate, is about the recommendations you may have on the role of the state as reinsurer of last resort when it is a case, according to this report.
Yeah, I can maybe take the last part of your question, and I will invite OECD to comment on the first part. On the role of governments and the role with the private sector, as I said briefly in my comments, there is definitely a strong role to be played by the private sector at two levels. One, in providing capacity, and we've seen the international reinsurance industry being quite committed to help provide additional capacity against disasters, but also in terms of technical expertise. All the expertise developed over decades by the insurance industry in terms of assessing the risks, measuring the risk, quantifying the risk is quite relevant. When we engage with our country partners in developing countries, beyond the policy work, we also try to help them move into implementation and to develop with them and identify with them a series of financial instruments that would help them become more financially resilient. And we usually work through what we call risk-layered approach. First of all, we make sure that within their own budget, they can set aside some funding to be able to cover regular losses. It's simply good management practice. The second layer, for slightly less frequent events will be some sort of line of credits they can quickly access in case of disaster. And in that case, the World Bank and other development banks are offering this kind of product. And ultimately, for extreme events, this is where sometimes some countries have reached out to the private sector to secure some additional capacity. I can mention, for example, the Pacific Alliance. Last year, including Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Colombia, issued a catastrophe bond against earthquakes. There are also supranational risk pools in place in Africa with the Africa Risk Capacity, in the Caribbean with the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, CRIF, as well as in the Pacific, and a new one is being established with the help of the World Bank in Southeast Asia. So those countries also do acknowledge that their public funding is limited, and they need to complement that, to blend that with access to private sector capacity, and the role of insurance definitely is critical.
I'd like to ask, Jack Reddish is the person who, his team produced a report, and he perhaps answers some of your questions as well.
Actually, Olivier really answered almost entirely the question alone, except for one part, which is why the European Solidarity Fund is not part of the report. It's because the scope of the country case studies included in the report are looking just at the national policy tools.
Okay, any other comments, any other questions? Yes?
Yes, thank you for this very interesting report. I'm working with finance ministries, and one thing that struck me when reading the report was the reluctance of finance ministry to acknowledge the existence of such a thing as potential contingent liabilities, which are basically commitments that would be not grounded in legislation. And I found your recommendation, or at least your point, which is that not acknowledging these implicit contingent liabilities is actually creating a greater risk, because this is generating the risk that there would be no formal ex-ante rules defined for managing natural disasters. Is a very powerful one. So I was wondering what was the reaction of the finance ministers when you made this point at the APEC meeting during which the report was presented?
I can start, since I was part of this discussion also with the finance ministers. I'm not sure that they show reluctance. Sometimes they may show ignorance, where they don't have the right tools to assess the fiscal and financial impact of those disasters. And since sometimes we talk about remote disasters, it's something that needs to be properly quantified, and it's not always easy. As my experience working with many of them, at least in middle and low income countries, as soon as you can quantify it and show them the potential impact on the economy, on their budget, they are of course much more aware of the need to find solutions. The way they communicate it also is a slightly different discussion, because this can create some social difficulties sometimes, but fundamentally from a pure economic perspective they are aware of that one, and of course with climate change this will simply increase in the future, and they're willing to find the right financial solution. So I think it's more about awareness than reluctance.
Still a couple of minutes if anybody's got any more questions or comments. Otherwise we'll close the conference there, the press conference there. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you.